One other time I stuck my neck out a little. One night out by the kitchen there at Mortain, there was a bunch of Germans there getting a bite to eat before they go on to the front. They really shouldn't have been there, but they did get some food. And one of them calls me, and I go over, and remember there's about 15 at least there, and he takes a stick and he draws in the dirt. Europa, you see, Europe here, United States, way over here. What are you doing here? I says, we're trying to kick you Germans out of France. And he didn't like it. There's a whole gang of German prisoners being marched to the beach to be taken over to England to be imprisoned. And I am told that the 101st Airborne captured them. But we were too busy to, so the infantry marched them to the beach and loaded them on whatever boats were available. But a lot of things happened. They brought me a wounded American that he and a buddy had captured a German payroll truck. Whew, and he had money on him in his clothes like you wouldn't believe. And he didn't say anything about it for about 3 days. But finally he learned that I wasn't some English-speaking German trying to get info. And he still had a hand grenade in his pocket. They had really never searched him. I don't know how they missed it, but they did. Just too busy, I guess. Anyway, after about the 3rd day of caring for him, he said, you know, I've got a lot of French francs in my clothes. A friend of mine and I, one of my buddies, captured a German payroll truck. We didn't know if the money was any good or not, but it was. So he kept a big bundle of it, and he stuffed it in his clothes. And he said, I would like to split that with you and your helper and myself. The Germans let me keep a little guy, an infantry guy. He wasn't worth a darn when it came to treating wounded, but they let me keep him there to help. And so this guy brings out all this money one day, and we split it up, a third, a third, a third. And he tells me about the hand grenade too. I said, you got a hand grenade? Yeah, he says. So I take it and I hide it where, where I hoped they would not find it. And I could have used it one time, but I knew better. What are you going to do? Kill a couple of high-ranking German officers and then get the whole bunch killed? No way. Meanwhile, I found an old German fountain pen that somebody had thrown away. It leaked ink, but I used it, even though it blurped out some on the paper. And you can always find a piece of paper somewhere. I had the run-of-the-mill of the place, and Mortain being a medic, and I could go to the kitchen, and I could go out to the restroom out back and shave if I could find a razor blade that would shave. Anyway, I found an American, some kind of a jacket that had a zipper on it. One of the guys had discarded it, and I made a money belt out of that thing. And I wore it around my chest instead of around my belly. If they're going to search you for a money belt or a secret belt, they're going to look around your waist. So I wore that thing up high around my chest, tight. It worked, and I kept information in that. And I knew that they didn't want me to keep any information, so that's why I put it in there. And I would add to it. And I've still got that original piece of paper at home, and I've made copies of it and put it in my airborne memory books. And it's totally authentic. It's adequate to a certain point. I couldn't go into great details. I buried Stanley Job and another one or two at Mortain. The French civilians dug a hole up on a hillside at Mortain and let him be buried with the French troops that were buried there. And the Germans were pretty good about letting me bury my dead there. And there weren't but 2 or 3. We didn't lose many. And they were usually brought to me too far gone to do anything with, although we tried night and day. And I did keep this scratch paper, and I kept their serial numbers and the date and the place where they were buried, which was very important. I got a letter from a general thanking me immensely for that. I guess they called him the adjutant general. I can't remember his name. He wrote me from Washington, D.C. But that's all you can do. Just do the best you can. They kept telling me that they were going to send my worst wounded on down into Brittany to where there was a regular prison hospital. Well, what it really was, it was just a hellhole of a place. I went there later. The facilities and the care there in Moortown was much better than down at the capital of capital of Brittany, which was Rennes. So I stayed at Moortown 7 weeks. Took care the best I could of the wounded. And then the lines came too close. So they evacuated myself and the wounded that I had on down into Rennes, Brittany. I got there and boy, I tell you, something to behold. Food was very scarce. Medical supplies consisted of 2 things, mercurochrome and crepe paper. Those little rolls of crepe paper worked pretty good. If you wanted gauze, you'd have to boil the scabs and the pus out of the, we boiled it hard. And then you'd put that gauze on a wound and wrap it with that crepe paper and tuck it under, and it worked pretty good. We were making do with what we had. Well, they gave me 14 wounded, some pretty seriously, to take care of. I had an Air Force pilot that had been burned in his plane before he jumped out, and he was delirious and unconscious, and he was charred to a black crisp, his head, face, and neck, in his arms and his hands, and he was not conscious. So my job was to watch him all night and then take care of all the rest and him during the day. I couldn't get any help. There were loafers around the place. There were 574 of us in that old building. So all night long I would sponge his lips with water, and I would keep him from clawing his face with his fingernails. In the night he would slowly go like this, and he'd sink those fingernails into that crust, and if nobody was watching him, he would bleed through that little mattress pad, and it would be on the floor in the mornings. So the people in charge there, whoever they were, decided that I would set up. And after about 6 days of that, why, Patton's Third Army were on the outskirts of town. You could hear the shelling, and oh boy, and he was shelling this old schoolhouse. Great chunks of plaster were falling off onto the wounded. The windows were flying out into the courtyard and into the halls. They were painted dark blue to keep light from going in. So I asked all of my wounded that could to get under their beds, you know, when the shelling was coming in. Well, the Air Force pilot couldn't, and one guy refused. He said, oh, hell no, I've come this far, I'm not crawling under my bed. So there's still Third Army shelling the building. So one brave soldier, I didn't know him, he decided to go tell them to knock it off. So he ties a white rag, part of it, maybe a pillowcase, if he could find one, or a piece of a sheet. He wires it onto a stick. I saw him do it. And he says he's going to go tell them. So he goes right out into the street, ignores the machine gun firing, and he's waving this thing. And he goes and he actually gets permission from the Germans to go do this. And he told them he'd come back. So he goes, and it isn't very long till the shelling subsides. They don't hit that building once again. And within an hour and a half, he comes back. Leaves the American lines back. Dangerous, very dangerous. Because how do you know who's been told this? Anyway, he comes back. And certainly, my hat's off to that brave soldier. Did us a great favor. I remembered. I wish I knew who he was to thank him. But It took 3 days to get the wounded out of that building. Of course, they went first. Remember, 574 in that building, and all but about 10% were wounded, and the rest of us trying to take care of them with nothing to work with. So we were sending the wounded out by jeep, by truck. They didn't have convoy of ambulance. Remember, Patton had just swept out of Normandy there by Alvaranches and swept down there about 55 or 60 miles, taking only the highway. The British wouldn't have done that. They're too cautious. Patton had the Germans on the run, and he just kept pressuring them, and that's what happened. He got the Rennes, and then Germans dug in and fought back for a day or so. Then suddenly they disappeared, and the 2 Polish guards that were in German uniform unloaded their rifles and handed them to us and announced that they were now prisoners. I said, "You'll be okay. We're not going to harm them." They were mercenaries fighting for the Germans. They tried to explain why. They told me that they were prisoners of the Germans. They were over in a prison camp. Their clothes were worn out. They were cold. They were hungry. And the Germans came to them and says, "Join us. You'll get travel, good pay, good food." So they joined up with them with the promise that they wouldn't have to go to the front. But they did. The Russians, the Germans, they were right there on the front, the Russian cavalry. But they promised them, join up and life will be a lot better for you. See, they kind of wanted to apologize to me for joining the German cause. But lots of them did that. There were lots of mercenaries fighting for the Germans, you know, from all countries. They took me to a place up near Cherbourg, quite a ways up to Cherbourg, put me into a place like a little small concentration thing. It had barbed wire, and they gave me a pup tent and some blankets, and I dug a trench around there because it had been raining. And I got in that little pup tent, and it was cold at night, and my covers got wet, and I got either the flu or a cold, and I got very dissatisfied just being kept there. So I told the officer in charge that I wanted to be gotten out of there, and he said, "We're going to replace you to another unit." I said, "No, you're not. I'm going back to England and get with my old outfit I've been with since basic training." He said, "No, we're going to reassign you." And I crawled back in the mud, and pretty soon I went to him and I told him, "When darkness falls tonight, I'm climbing over that fence. You've made no effort to get me out of here." He cursed me out and threatened to court-martial me, and I wouldn't even want to try to tell you what I told him. So I went back and crawled in that mud hole, and he came a little bit before dark and parted the flaps on the tent and says, "Gibson, you stay put. I'm going to get you out of here early in the morning." He said, "You stay put." I said, "I believe you, I will." Next morning before daylight, he wakened me and took me by jeep to a little landing strip somewhere, and I crawled in a Piper Cub type airplane behind a one-star general and a big guy that was the pilot, just 3 of us. And the plane warmed up for quite a while, and this general was very talkative. He wanted to know what the world happened to me and so forth, and he told me that he was in charge of all of the railroads in occupied France. He had been a railroad official, and he had the rank of a one-star general. And we flew to London. Partway over the channel, the weather got pretty fierce, and this plane would drop and then stop suddenly, just like hitting rock bottom. But we made it. It was a little plane. We made it all right. And I went straight to the U.S. intelligence, and I talked